There is a small plastic rectangle on your wall that you and someone you love have been quietly at war over since October. It is set to 71 degrees. One of you considers this a hostile act. That is winter now. A thermostat, a grudge, and a blanket with sleeves. Which is odd when you consider that for most of human history, winter wasn't really a season. It was a 4-month audit of every decision you made back in August. So, how did ancient humans survive winter? Not in the inspirational sense, in the boring, specific sense. What did a person actually have to do between the first frost and the first green shoot to still be breathing in April? The popular answers arrive quickly and all wear the same confident expression. They were tougher than us, hardier stock, basically human sled dogs. They had fur clothing, which people say the way you'd say cheat code, as though a dead elk assembles itself into a parka out of respect. They walked south, as if the entire Ice Age were a timeshare. And my personal favorite, which is a real published hypothesis we will absolutely come back to, some of them may have hibernated. Every one of these has a crumb of truth in it, and not one of them survives contact with a calendar. Toughness does not generate calories. Hides do not tailor themselves. And you cannot walk away from winter when winter is 2,000 miles wide and everyone else has already had the same idea. The real answer is less heroic and far more impressive. Humans survived winter by becoming the only animal on Earth that solves a problem several months before it arrives. Start with the body, because the body is genuinely bad at this. We are tropical apes. Naked skin, thin fat layer, a cooling system built around sweating, which is a spectacular adaptation for chasing an antelope across a hot plain and an actively dangerous one in a snowstorm, because sweat inside your clothing will kill you faster than the cold outside it. A wet, still human in still air at 50 degrees Fahrenheit is in trouble. Not uncomfortable. In trouble. Every cold-adapted mammal you can name solved this with hardware: bear fat, wolf undercoat, hare feet. Evolution's answer for us was to leave the body alone and change the to-do list. That outsourcing had prerequisites. Fire, obviously, controlled well enough to keep going in wind and wet. Clothing, which is not a hide draped over a shoulder, but a fitted, layered, sewn system with a warm inner layer and a windproof outer one. The difference between a blanket and a coat is roughly the difference between hoping and planning. Shelter that traps a bubble of body-warmed air. And underneath all of it, the strangest one, the ability to sit in the sunshine of late summer, vividly imagine a colder and hungrier version of yourself in February, and do unpleasant work today on that guy's behalf. Squirrels cache nuts on instinct. Humans store food out of dread, which is arguably a worse system emotionally, but a much better one strategically, because dread can be planned around. That is the part people miss. Winter almost never kills by temperature. It kills by arithmetic. Plants stop producing. Animals get thin or leave. Meanwhile, your own body starts burning extra fuel just to hold your core temperature steady, which means your expenses go up in exactly the month your income goes down. Winter isn't a cold problem. It's a budgeting problem with a hard deadline. For most of our species' existence, small mobile groups solved that budget informally, without a single institution, rule, or manager. They moved, not randomly, but on a seasonal circuit, arriving at the sheltered valley and the river crossing at the time of year those places paid out. That knowledge existed nowhere except inside the heads of people who had already lived through 40 or 50 winters, which made the group's elders something like a cloud backup with hip pain. They tanned and sewed. They dried, smoked, and froze meat. They rendered fat, which is the densest calorie storage available in nature, and the reason lean protein is a modern wellness fantasy and an ancient death sentence. And they stored surplus in the one place that never spoils: other people. You cannot keep a whole reindeer. You can, however, give most of it away and convert it into obligation, which keeps indefinitely and appreciates in a bad year. Ethnographically, this shows up again and again among foragers. Meat gets shared out widely, almost compulsively, and the sharing is not sentimental. It is insurance. A hunter's luck swings wildly. A group's average luck is much steadier. So you pay premiums in good weeks and file claims in bad ones. Which brings us to Gary. Every group has a Gary. Gary is very enthusiastic about the eating portion of the arrangement and consistently unavailable for the firewood portion. Gary has strong opinions about how the drying racks should be built and has personally never built one. In a band of 30 people, there is no court, no fine, no HR department. There is only the fact that everyone has known Gary since he was 4 and remembers every single thing he has ever done. Reputation was the enforcement mechanism. Gossip was the review platform, and Gary's page had 1.5 stars. Nobody threw him out. The punishment was subtler and much worse. Yeah, Gary can stay. Gary's just not getting the good spot by the fire. That system worked beautifully at a scale of 30 people who could all see each other. Then humans stopped walking. Farming did not solve winter. It rescheduled it. Grain is a magnificent way to survive a cold season. It dries, it stores, it stacks, it waits. It is also, unlike a herd of animals, something you cannot follow when it runs out, something a neighbor can steal, something a stranger can tax, and something that runs out on a very predictable schedule. Europe's farmers had a name for the stretch between the last of the stores and the first of the new crop. Not winter, the hungry gap, late winter into spring. When the snow is melting, the days are getting longer. Everything looks like it's improving, and the granary is a room with echo. Add livestock and it gets worse, because now you need hay, which means your winter survival is decided by how much grass you cut in July while sweating. Settlement turns survival into logistics, and logistics has deadlines. The archaeology of this is better than you'd expect, given that the two most important winter technologies, clothing and firewood, both rot. At Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov, in what is now the Czech Republic, people were living through full Ice Age winters roughly 31,000 to 25,000 years ago, in structures partly framed with mammoth bone, around deep hearths, with fired clay figurines that count among the earliest known ceramics anywhere. Humanity invented the kiln and used it first for art, which tells you something lovely about us. Clay fragments from the site also carry impressions of woven fiber, cordage, basketry, textiles, meaning that by the last Ice Age people had string, and string is the quiet foundation of nets, snares, bindings, and sewn clothing. At Ohalo, too, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, a camp preserved underwater for roughly 23,000 years gave up something almost nobody expects to survive: bedding. Actual grass bedding, laid down in layers around a hearth, along with tens of thousands of plant remains including wild cereals, gathered and brought back to the site. Somebody made a bed. Somebody made a bed 23,000 years ago, and then presumably complained that it was still cold. Then there is the eyed needle, which deserves far more fame than it gets. Examples from Siberian sites, including Denisova Cave, date to roughly 40,000 years ago, and a needle with a hole in it is the difference between wrapping yourself in a skin and wearing a garment that actually seals at the wrist. As for when clothing itself began, one of the odder lines of evidence comes from genetics. Body lice, which live in clothing rather than hair, appear to have split from head lice somewhere in the range of 100,000 years ago or more. We dated the invention of the coat using the parasites that moved into it. At Mezerik in Ukraine, around 15,000 years ago, people built dwellings out of mammoth bone. The famous one used the jawbones of dozens of animals, stacked in a deliberate herringbone pattern, with hearths inside. At Dra in Jordan, purpose-built granaries have been dated to roughly 11,300 years ago, which is notable because that's before full-blown agriculture. Storage came first. The barn arrived before the farm. And at Skara Brae in Orkney, around 3100 BCE, stone houses were built partly sunk into a mound of accumulated household waste, with a central hearth, stone furniture, and thick insulating walls. The Neolithic answer to double glazing was to live inside your own compost heap, and it worked so well the buildings are still standing 5,000 years later. This is where the story gets messy. In 2020, two researchers examining the extraordinary bone assemblage at Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca, Spain, hundreds of thousands of years old, proposed that the growth disruptions they saw in the bones looked like seasonal metabolic slowdown, hibernation, actual, literal, human hibernation. Most specialists were unconvinced. and pointed out that severe seasonal malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency can produce similar marks without anyone entering torpor. But nobody has closed the question with a hammer, and that is the honest state of a lot of this field. The same fog sits over the Neanderthals, who lived through glacial European winters for a very long time before we did. Their bodies show what look like cold adaptations: shorter limbs, broad torsos, large nasal cavities that may have warmed incoming air, but researchers still argue about how much of that was climate shaping them and how much was simply what their lineage already looked like. There's a related fight about their clothing: no needles, plenty of hide-working tools, and a great deal of disagreement about whether they wore something fitted or something merely wrapped. The gap between those two options, in a January at 55 degrees north, is enormous, and we cannot currently close it. So, which factor actually carried people through? Was it fire and shelter, the pure physics of staying warm? Was it the technology of tailored clothing, which let a tropical ape walk into Siberia at all? Was it food storage and the calendar-brained planning behind it? Or was it the social arrangement, the sharing, the obligations, the pooling of risk that meant one family's catastrophic hunting season wasn't automatically fatal? Archaeology is very good at some of this and completely blind to the rest. It can give us hearths, butchered bones, storage pits, seeds, and isotope signatures from teeth that hint at seasonal diets. It cannot tell us how cold anyone felt who quietly starved in February, what the inside of a coat looked like, or how many arguments were required to make anyone go outside for more wood. Archaeology, annoyingly, did not leave a sticky note explaining whose job that was. The honest answer is probably some combination of all of these, depending on time and place. And the mix almost certainly looked different in an Ice Age river valley than it did in a Neolithic village with a full granary and a resident Gary. What we can trace is what happened once the storage became permanent, because storage changes everything downstream of it. A full granary is a thing that must be counted, guarded, allocated, and argued over. Some of the earliest writing we have from Uruk in Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE is not poetry or law. It's inventory: barley, sheep, oil, textiles. Humanity's first written words were, more or less, accounts payable. Temples became warehouses with priesthoods attached, redistributing stores in a system where the difference between a tithe and a subscription fee was mostly the branding. Then came the truly clever move: making the calendar sacred. Midwinter festivals cluster around the solstice across a startling number of cultures, and they tend to land on exactly the week when there is nothing to do outside. Morale has bottomed out, and, critically for a farming society, you must slaughter the animals you cannot afford to feed until spring. The Old English name for November was Blotmonath, the month of sacrifice, which is a poetic way of saying the killing is scheduled. Rome had Saturnalia in the dark of December, complete with feasting and social rules turned upside down. And later, in medieval Christian Europe, the long fast of Lent sat neatly on top of the hungry gap, the period when the stores were empty anyway. Declaring the emptiest weeks of the year to be holy self-denial is, on a public relations level, an outstanding piece of work. Storage became surplus. Surplus became property. Property became taxes. Taxes became a god who wanted a percentage and got it, and none of this ever really went away. The next time a snowstorm gets forecast and your local grocery store is stripped of bread, milk, and inexplicably all the batteries, understand that you are watching a 12,000-year-old reflex operating with a shopping cart. We still feast in the darkest week of the year. We still eat enormously in late December and then lie motionless on a couch for 3 days, which, and I want to be careful here, is not hibernation, but is doing an unsettlingly good impression of it. We still get quietly sad when the light goes, and we have given it a clinical name instead of a god. Gary, meanwhile, is thriving. Gary is the one in the group chat during the blizzard typing, "Let me know if you guys need anything," from inside, with the heat on, having offered nothing specific. The difference is that we get to be petty about it now. Somewhere in your house is that thermostat and that grudge, and someone who thinks 71 degrees is an outrage. That argument is a luxury item. It means the winter budget is handled. The stores are full. The hungry gap has been outsourced to a supply chain, and nobody in the building is doing calorie math. Winter never got warmer. We just got much better at August.